So lead rolls in, and he kind of lost track exactly where he was because we're looking at nothing but jungle. So it's really hard to pinpoint where something is when all you see is green. So 2 calls off with a mayday, mayday, I'm on fire. What had happened was the hit in the tail had cut the hydraulic line to the speed brake. On the 105, the speed brake's in the tail. I fire the rockets and then I squeeze off a few more rounds of 20 Mike Mike, and then I pull off looking for number 3. The other problem was if you got it into a spin, it was very problematic that you may or may not get it out of a spin. In fact, I think probably more times than not, it didn't come out. Being a young 22, 23-year-old single red-blooded male, being in a single-seat, single-engine, afterburning, supersonic gun-carrying fighter, why, it was great. I loved it. My name is Marty Case. I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on April 29, 1938. Grew up in Philadelphia for a few years, and then my mom died. We moved to Florida. I went to high school, and when I graduated from high school, I couldn't afford to go to college, so I elected to join the military. My dad, having been in Patton's Third Army at the end of World War II, he talked about the military and all that, so I decided I'd go in the military, get my 4-year obligation out of the way, save up some money, and go to college after my 4 years were up. Fortunately or unfortunately, once I got in the military and got a car, I found girls, so that kind of ended the saving the money thing. While I was there in the Air Force, my job was tow reel operator, which operates a big reel, kind of like a giant fishing reel. It has armored cable attached to it that you pull targets with that other pilots and fighters come in and shoot at. And they put different colored wax on the bullets, and that puts holes in the target, and that's how you score who got how many shots on the target. But as a airman, a crew member, I got to fly with a lot of pilots, and several of them encouraged me to try to get into pilot training. Not having a college education, I did have a high school diploma, but they said there was a program called Aviation Cadets, where if you had a high school diploma and you passed a big battery of tests, actually it was a 3-day long test, I took it Air Base in excuse me, Mississippi. If you passed that and could pass the physical, then you could get in cadets, which is what happened. So I was in class 60 Foxtrot, which means our graduating date was 18 March 1960. Went from, at the time, I was at Eglin Air Force Base as a tow reel operator. Went from there to primary cadet training, which was at Lackland. Spent 2 months there. Went from there to primary in Marianna, Florida. Spent 6 months there. Went to Reese Air Force Base for basic pilot training. And graduated from there, distinguished graduate, first in the class, in 18 March 1960. On graduation, you got to pick your assignment by your class order. They put you in the classroom one day and listed all the assignments on a board, on a chalkboard, and listed all the names. And then number 1 would stand up. What do you want? I picked F-100. Crossed the F-100 off, crossed my name off, wrote it down. Did that all the way down through the class, and that's how I ended up in the F-100. After we were finished, kind of interesting, Buddy came up to me, Larry Jacobs, who had a brother-in-law. His sister was married to a guy flying F-101s in England. And one of the 100 assignments was to England. Happened to be the one I took. Well, Larry got the one for Itazuki, Japan. So he came up to me after it was all over and said, do you really want to go to Japan or go to England? I said, I don't know, why? He said, well, my sister's married this guy flying 101s, and I'd kind of like to get over there with my sister. Would you mind changing with me? I said, no, F-100's an F-100. Doesn't really matter to me where I fly it. So we did. We swapped, and he ended up going to England, and I ended up going to Japan, which, long story short, was where I met my wife. But anyway, so we did swap, and went through Nellis out of, first went to Luke, finished the F-100 training there, went up to Nellis, got the nuclear delivery training there, and air refueling. He went to England, I went to Japan. While I was in Japan, he had to go to bomb commander school. We sat Nuke Alert. At least 1 week out of every month, you were on the pad as a bachelor. Excuse me. I pulled 2 weeks because in the meantime, when I graduated from Luke, or Nellis rather, before going over to Japan, I had wrecked my car, my DeSoto. And I thought I'd get a Corvette, fighter pilot, got to have a Corvette, right? So we drove from Nellis all the way to his place in Milwaukee, nonstop. That's a long story I won't bore you with, but it was an interesting ride. We get there, and I took an airplane ride over to Detroit, picked up this Corvette, and I spent the whole day doing it because I told him I was going overseas. And the good thing for me was that at the time, General Motors was on strike. The workers were on strike. So they were desperate to sell cars. And even though I told them I was going overseas, they asked for some names, people to call to verify I was who I was a good guy, I wasn't going to skip without paying for it, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, I get the car, drive to Florida, visit my folks, drive to the coast, put on a boat, ship it to Japan. So it was there when I got there. But it was interesting, sitting around and telling these guys my history. I'd never had to do that before, but anyway, that's how I got my Corvette. So I got to Japan and got to the 35th Squadron, 8th TAC Fighter Wing, the original 8th TAC Fighter Wing. And as I said, we sat Nuke Alert usually 1 to 2 weeks out of the month. And the good deal about that was I could live on my base pay, which is $222 a month. And amazingly enough, my car payments were $200 a month. So I was living on my TDY pay and using my base pay to pay for the car, which worked out fine. And I was there, got there in 61, and in 63 we transitioned to the 105. And about that time is when I met my future wife, now wife. But we transitioned to the 105, and then about a year later we shut a Suzuki down, moved up to Yokota. And Yokota was where we were at the time in Southeast Asia started warming up. Excuse me. The 36th had been tagged with the assignment to go down to Korat Air Base in Thailand. But they were short a couple of guys. I don't know if the guys were scared about the combat or whether they just really had other things to do. Whatever. Anyway, they asked for volunteers, and my future wife and I at the time had a little spat. So she said, as we were leaving, as I was leaving, she said, "Why don't you go TDY or something?" The next day, this pops up. So I stick my hand up, say, "Yeah, I'll volunteer for it." So I volunteered to go to Southeast Asia. Well, a day or so later, she starts trying to figure out why I'm not calling. She starts calling around and gets a hold of this one guy. Said, "Where's Marty?" Says, "Can't tell you." Says, "Why not? It's classified."
Really?
Well, as it happened, this friend of mine, another bachelor, we'd had a big party at this bachelor house. There was 3 major bachelor houses in Japan at the time. And for some reason, we decided to throw this guy into they had little reflecting pools. The Japanese are big on little very serene type thing, Zen type reflecting pools. Well, this one happened to have a rock in the middle of it. When we picked this guy up to toss him into it, his back landed right on the rock, which put him in the hospital. Very painful. Larry. So Larry's in the hospital. Well, my wife happened to be a nurse. So she finds out Larry's in there. So she goes into Larry and says, "Where's Marty?" "Oh, I can't tell you that. That's classified." She says, "Do you want your pain meds or not?" So my wife's good at torture anyway. She ended up telling him where I was, and that's how she found out. So the 36 took the airplanes down, and I went down on a 130. Was the first guy to step off the airplane there at Korat, and told the captain, who was the base commander at the time, he had, I think, 8 airmen, and the captain was the base commander, and that was it. And three or four little wooden huts with screen sidings. That's all there was, bare concrete. So we were on the opposite side from the Thais. The Thais had a hangar and all that. They had F-86s at the time. That's why the base was there. And I told him that, you know, he was going to have a C-130 or a C-124 Globemaster land every 4 hours, and he needed to find a way to offload it. And that's what they ended up doing. He borrowed a huge forklift from the Army, and they had stuff stacked around the edge of that ramp, because every time an airplane came in, he had nowhere to take it. So he just stuck it out there in the grass alongside the ramp. And by the second or third day, he just was literally running out of places to stack the stuff.
Wow.
Anyway, the guys were stuck at Kadena a couple of days for weather, and they finally got there. And so we were drawing up all these plans and all that, and this other guy and myself got tagged. No, I better not tell that story. We were tagged to be the top secret guys. We had messages coming in from 4 different places. We had a message center. The Army had 2, and there was another one that belonged to somebody else. And they're all top secret. Of course, we all had top secret clearances dealing with nukes. But the maintenance guy would have part of the message, and the armorer would have part of the message, and ops would have part of the message, frag orders. And they were getting scattered all over the place, and nobody, other than where the message center had logged them in that they had received them. After that, we would pick them up, take them to ops, and they would distribute them. But nobody was signing for them when they were distributed. Make a long story short, we were unable to track some of these messages. Again, top secret. So this other guy and myself were tagged with the job of tracking down these top secret messages and making sure everybody signed for it. But after a few days, we got that under control, and then they were trying to get ready to support whatever we were supposed to support. At the time, we had no idea what we were going to be doing. But they set up a flight of 4 on Strip Alert. They would sit out there, sit in the airplane. They would go to, I think it was 30-minute alert, you had to be sitting in ops, and then 5-minute alert, you had to be in the airplanes. And they would call from headquarters down and tell us when to go from 30-minute to 5-minute, and when to launch, and what the target was. So that's what happened then. Then one day they launched the flight of 4, but for whatever reason they could never get in contact with the controller, so they didn't do anything. So they came back and landed. The next day, I happened to be number 4 in the flight. They decided they'd let me fly finally, since I was from another squadron. I was low man on the totem pole, but they elected to let me fly as number 4. Always a good position to be in. And we launched and got a hold of the controller and found out it was a AAA site that was shooting at this, we assumed it was an Air America airplane. It was a C-123 twin-engine airplane. The Hassenfuss airplane, if anybody remembers the little Hassenfuss incident. But anyway, it was bothering him. It kept shooting at him. And so we got there. We got up on his frequency and said, "Well, where's the target?" He says, "Well, I'll fly over it and you can see where he is when he starts shooting." So that's what he did. He flew over there and got close, and the guy started shooting at him. Our leader, Jack Stressing, was the leader. He says, yeah, we see him, okay, and this guy, he lumbers out of sight in this big old right. flying target. So lead rolls in, and he kind of lost track exactly where he was, because we're looking at nothing but jungle, so it's really hard to pinpoint where something is when all you see is green. So he said, well, I'll roll in and see if I can get his attention. I'll, shoot some 20 millimeter at him, or into the jungle. In the meantime, we had zero combat experience. Nobody in the theater had combat experience since we were the first. So we set up a square box pattern just like we would on the gunnery range, which of course you would never want to do. We were holding the normal pattern airspeed, normal altitude above the ground all the way around, and the bad news is, of course, every time you roll out on final, you're rolling out, on the same track as the guy in front of you, just like on the range. Well, this is wonderful for the guy on the ground shooting at you, because he doesn't have to track anything. He just sets the gun, squeezes the trigger, and sits there and drinks his tea or whatever, So anyway, Jack rolls in. He doesn't see anything, but he starts shooting. Well, about that time, 2 had rolled in right behind Jack. Well, the gunner on the ground who was shooting at Jack missed him and hit number 2, Davy Graben, in the tail. So 2 calls off with a mayday, mayday, I'm on fire. What had happened was the hit in the tail had cut the hydraulic line to the speed brake. On the 105, the speed brake's in the tail. It had cut that line, which is of course right next to the burner liner, which means that it caught fire. So he's got a little fire going in the ass end. Well, lead says, 3, you take over the flight. This is lead. I'm joining up on 2. We're going for home plate. Davey, in the meantime, had talked to a Pratt & Whitney rep at one time and said, what's the word on the engines? What should I do if I ever get hit? Yada, yada. And the guy said, I recommend going to afterburner. He said, if it lights, you're good to go, and you got more thrust than you need. Just leave it in burner and climb as high as you can. And if it doesn't light, it doesn't light. You know what you got. But in any case, the afterburner's behind the engine, and you're not going to hurt anything. Okay. So that's exactly what Davey did. He went to burner, and they head out for home plate. Well, I didn't know where 3 was, but I had been watching the guys rolling in, and 3 kind of went where they were going. And when it came my turn, I got up there where everybody else had been rolling in, and the guy starts shooting at me. So I squeezed off some 20 millimeter, and then I fired the rockets. And oh, by the way, all we had was 20 millimeter, 1,000 rounds, and 2 rocket pods. That was our total load. Because we had a 650-gallon tank centerline and 2 450-gallon tanks on the wings, because we didn't have any tankers. They didn't have any tankers set up at the time. This was was the very beginning. Nothing was set up. So anyway, I fire the rockets, and then I squeeze off a few more rounds of 20 Mike, and then I pull off looking for number 3. I don't see 3 at all, and then I pull off, and I'm starting back around, and then the CIA guy, I think, called and said, 4 of your wingman's over at so-and-so. So I picked up number 3, joined up on him, and then he starts giving me the HEFO. He has no radio.
Oh, man.
So now I was in charge. Number 4, where's home plate? Well, I had fortunately had drawn up a good map and had some idea where we were, and I got us home okay. But that made us the first flight of 4 F-105s to fire a shot in combat in Southeast Asia. And that's my number 1 claim to fame. Big deal. The F-100 had some problems. It was for its time, it was the first airplane the Air Force had that would go supersonic and level flight. But because they weren't all that familiar with supersonic aerodynamics at the time, it had some problems, and the biggest problem was adverse yaw. For those of you that aren't aeronautical engineers, and I'm not either, but the down aileron causes more drag than the up aileron, and under certain conditions it will cause that wing to stall first in a very rapid manner, which normally causes the airplane to roll totally inverted, called a snap roll or half roll. That was one problem it had. The other one was yaw roll coupling, which is hard to explain aerodynamically, but it basically made the airplane a little squirrely in yaw. And besides being underpowered, the other problem was if you got it into a spin, it was very problematic that you may or may not get in and out of a spin. In fact, I think probably more times than not, it didn't come out. The ones that did would jettison the canopy early, and that seemed to help get the nose down, and then you could recover. But aside from that, it was a very interesting airplane, and of course being a young 22, 23-year-old single red-blooded male, being in a single-seat, single-engine, afterburning, supersonic gun-carrying fighter, it was great. I loved it.
Dave told me about Dave Work. He told me about that adverse yaw was a really big problem, and he goes, especially in the pattern when you're typically lower altitude.
When you're slow. Anytime you slow down or under high G loading, and I watched a guy, unfortunately, he hit the ground one day in the pattern. He was turning base leg and just got too slow. You had to use the rudders, and for a jet engine airplane, using the rudders was not normal, but in the F-100 it was normal because you could use the rudder to counteract the yaw that would occur with the adverse yaw. So if you could use the rudders, you were going to be okay normally. But if you didn't pay attention to your airspeed and what you were doing with the stick and the rudders, you could get into trouble. They also had a problem with when you pull the tail section to pull the engines, the entire tail section would come off as a unit, and then they could unbolt the engine and then pull the engine. Well, the hydraulic lines to the stabilator had a quick disconnect, so that when you disconnected the lines, you wouldn't lose any fluid. There was a problem. There were two types, and one of them was a Wiggins disconnect, and they would come disconnected on their own. And that happened to a guy named Fred Alvord while I was at Itazuki. He was on final approach shooting a GCA, and his wingman noticed they were dropping low. And about that time, GCA started calling you. You need to pull it up. You're getting low, getting low. And Fred made one transmission. I think it was flight controls, was what he said. And as he was getting lower, his wingman was going up a little bit, and he could look into the cockpit, and he saw that Fred had both feet on the instrument panel and both hands on the stick trying to pull it back, trying to get the nose to come up, and it would not come up. What had happened was, when this quick disconnect unfastens, you now have what's called a hydraulic lock. The fluid can't go anywhere, and you cannot compress a fluid.
Right.
So he wasn't about to move that stabilator. There was nothing he could do.
So the stabilator was fixed.
It was locked in that position, and he hit the ground and ended up burning up in the airplane.
Oh.
So the 100 had some problems, but at the time it was the best airplane we had, and there were a lot of them. They made thousands of them. So it was, it was a decent airplane. It was good for gunnery and slow speed, but it wasn't a real fast airplane, especially not like the 105. But then again, weren't that many that were. But that's the one I sat most of the Nuke Alert in, was the F-100. Okay, get back on track. While I was in Karat, by the way, I had a date to get married. That was in August, and my wedding was set up for October. So I kind of needed to get back to get things going with the wedding, get all the paperwork through, and there was a bunch of it. But so I started heading back, but they stopped me off in Okinawa because at the time we had set up a a mini school, if you will, for the bullpup missile. The bullpup missile, the 105 had a little controller on the left-hand side. It was like flying a model airplane, and it was for flying the bullpup. And there was only one range that we could use to shoot the bullpup at, and it happened to be down there at Okinawa. It was Aishima, actually. It's the island where, what's that guy who wrote Willie and Joe? World War II cartoonist? Anyway, famous World War II, can't think of his name. But anyway, Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle was shot by the Japs on that island in World War II, so that's why the U.S. military turned it into a target range. So we kept bombing it. Anyway, so they asked me to stop off there because they were having troubles with the maintenance. They couldn't keep the 4 airplanes in the air. So I don't know if it was because they knew I knew about machinery or messed around with cars or what, but anyway, they asked me to stop off there and get the maintenance going again. So that's what I did. I spent a week there and got everything going, and they did have some problems. A little bit of it was the people on the base were having a hard time thinking about helping another wing. At the time, the 8th Wing and the 18th, they were kind of like competitors. We used to have gunnery meets and all that. So it was very competitive, and they kind of didn't want to help us, but I went down and explained this. One, for instance, was the TACAN was out one of the airplanes. Now, the 105 had a Doppler nav system, but your primary means of navigating, of course, was the TACAN. Gives you range and bearing to the station. And so as the only navigational aid in the cockpit, other than the Doppler, you had to have it work. So they pulled the TACAN box out of the airplane, and we took it down to base shops to the electronics section, and asked the guy to check it out. He did. He said, "Oh, it's got a bad transistor." So I said, "Well, can't we get it fixed?" He said, "My sergeant has to tell me to fix it." So now we have the problem. So I get the sergeant in there, and I kind of explained it to him that, this wasn't a play game. This is a real war we got going. People are really getting shot at down there, and we need to get this airplane fixed so that we could get them the training they needed before they went into combat. This is not a game anymore. And he finally saw the light and told the guy to fix the transistor. So that's the kind of thing that we had to go through before we finally got everybody on board and could have all the airplanes up code 1 and flying again. So finally I got back to Yokota. By this time it's into September, and I'm getting married the 3rd of October. So we were dancing through some hoops to get that done, but finally got it done. We started sending other people down there, but since I had already been and was a short timer, I had a return date for the States in March again. So they kept me back, especially since I had just gotten married. And I went back to McConnell. When I got to McConnell, I got to meet some people, and said, "Well, what squadron are you going to send me to?" They said, "Well, the 563rd is over at Tok Lee, and they just lost a couple of guys, so you're going to be a replacement for that." Swell. So I take my new bride back to the house there we got in Derby, just south of the base at McConnell, and explained to her I'd be going to Southeast Asia, so we started getting everything ready for that. In the meantime, of course, I bought a new 65 Corvette, which I still have, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, it's in the garage. And on the way over there, I'm sitting on the airplane, and I got talking to this guy next to me. He's a captain. I'm still a first lieutenant. And it turns out to be Paul Craw. You probably haven't heard of him, but most of the people that flew the 105s knows Paul Craw. Best combat leader I've ever seen. And so I asked him where he was going. He said, "Oh, well, I'm going over to 563rd. "Oh, so am I." "Well, okay, yeah." We chatted for a while. I said, well, when we get there, I'd like to be in your flight if I can. He said, okay, I can guarantee it. He says, apparently I'm going to be a flight commander, which is based on seniority, and a flight commander is the most senior of the flight commanders, A, B, C, D.
Okay.
Which makes him just junior to the ops officer, who was second in command, basically.
Oh, wow.
So that's what happened. I was in Paul's flight, and that's where I met up with Kyle Berg, who I had gone through pilot training and F-100 training with. Ended up getting shot down, which we'll cover later. But and a guy named Billy R. Sparks. Anybody that went to Germany knows Billy Sparks. He's quite a character and a great storyteller, and half of them are true. So anyway, we're flying missions and doing a good job, I thought. And then one day, we go back and we're reporting that they're building SAM sites. They're building SAM sites, and they say, yeah, but don't attack them because they're not going. They're just using that in case we do something we shouldn't. So don't attack the SAM sites. What? What do you mean? Don't attack the SAM? Yeah. Well, what about the airfields? Can we? No, you can't attack the airfields. What the devil's going on here? What kind of war is this? Anyway, that's the kind of stuff, ground rules we were operating under. So one day this flight of 4 F-4s is up flying around, and lo and behold, this big white missile comes up from the ground and actually knocks one out of the sky and damages another one that ended up they had to bail out. So it got 2 airplanes with one SA-2, basically, is what it was, SA-2 guideline. So they grounded, everything grounded, right? And we sat on the ground for a couple of days. In the meantime, Lyndon Johnson gets together with McNamara, and they decide they're going to have a big raid on the SAM sites. Well, it's not bad enough that the bad guys can probably figure out after what happened you're going to attack their SAM sites, but Johnson gets on the TV and tells them we're going to attack their SAM sites. Not only that, he gives them specifically one of the sites that we're going to attack. He tells them
On TV.
which site on national TV. So, finally on the 27th of July, we're going to attack it. Well, we went through the briefing, went out to the airplane, and they couldn't decide what to use against this new weapon that we were going to strike. They didn't know if we were going to use bombs, they didn't know if we were going to use rockets. We ended up with the worst possible munitions. After they made 2 changes, and we ended up with napalm. Now, you haven't delivered napalm, I'm sure, but it required a 350 knot indicated airspeed, level attitude, 1G, which means you're flying straight and level.
Straight level, yeah.
Into all those guns that are going to be there. Well, anyway, we go out there, and of course there have been so many changes that I got to my airplane, I was number 4, and they had just gotten there. And they didn't have all the napalm tanks fused, so I ended up helping the armor fuse my napalm tank and their anti-withdrawal fuses, which means if you cross-thread it and try to back it out, it's going to explode.
Really? Really?
Yeah. So the guy briefed me. He says, "Whatever you do, if you get one cross-threaded, call me." I said, "Not to worry."
No problem.
So anyway, we get the thing loaded. I jump in the airplane, get her cranked out, and I taxi out. And I'm still bringing the AC generator on the line as I'm pulling out of my parking area because the guys ahead of me, who were loaded ahead of me, are taxiing out. But I managed to fall right into place, no problem. And we put out on the runway, or we put out on the taxiway, our arming area, and got everybody armed up. Well, one of the guys in our squadron, Al Logan, was a spare, and he was sitting off to the right-hand side. Well, unfortunately, his airplane had a problem in that when they pulled the pins that safed the pylons, so that if you accidentally hit the jettison button in the cockpit before they pulled the pin, it wouldn't fire. Well, unfortunately, when they pulled the pin, both of them fired. Bang! 2 full 450-gallon tanks, and they start leaking jet fuel right away.
Oh, gosh.
And Al was so frustrated he was beating the sides of the airplane with his fists. Because as crazy as it sounds, as bad as everybody knows it's going to be, it's one of those missions you don't want to be left out of. But he didn't get to go for that reason. So anyway, we pull on the runway and we take off and we get to the tanker. And then we head for downtown Hanoi. We started the descent and we hit the Red River and turned south, or east, southeast, and came down the river. Well, as we're going down the river, we're at about 100 feet, doing about 0.9 Mach, which is way above the release speed for the munitions. But who cares? Because they were shooting at us by this time.
It's almost
and
double,
I could
isn't
see
it?
all the stuff going across the top of us. And lead, Paul Craw, called back and said, "What's it look like, Marty?" I said, "We need to get lower," and we did. So we ended up at about 5 to 10 feet off the ground, 0.9 Mach, screaming down the Red River, the valley. The river S-turns, so you're going across land sometime, water sometime. And I was so busy looking around and watching for MiGs and whatever and all that I really wasn't doing any navigating, but Paul, that was not a problem with him. He found the target and I pickled my bombs into the big bonfire, pulled off, and as we're exiting, Kyle calls out, "Lead, I've been hit." And I look up and sure enough, and there was Paul's airplane, and Kyle had been number 2. And he was slowly falling back, and as he came alongside Sparky, I could see that his airplane, from the intakes back, was nothing but flame, and he was leaving a black trail of smoke.
Really?
I could not believe that airplane was still flying.
Wow.
It's one of those things you look at, but you cannot believe it. And he's slowing down and slowing down and slowing down. He gets alongside me, and we're still down at about 15, well, maybe up to 50 feet by this time. And as he gets alongside me, all at once, his airplane goes bang. I figured, well, that's the end of Kyle. Well, just before it did that, I saw a little white puff of smoke, and then it did its maneuver. And I looked back, and I didn't see anything. So, but again, we're still doing 0.9 Mach or better. And Paul called back and said, "Did he get out? Did you see a chute?" I said, "Negative on the chute. He didn't get out." So we pressed on. To interrupt the story at this point, 7.5 years later, when Kyle came out of the prison there at Hanoi Hilton, he told me that he made about, what I saw apparently, that little puff of smoke was him getting out of the airplane. And we were going so fast, he was so far behind us that by the time his chute opened, he said, "You were just little kind of dots on the horizon." He said,
Really?
And he said, "I made about 2 swings in the chute and I was on the ground."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, what if we'd come back?" He said, "If you had, I'd probably be dead, because no sooner did I hit the ground than 4 or 5 of these kids, they look like, came running up with guns and their hands are shaking like that." He said, "If anybody had done anything to scare them or anything," he said, "they'd have probably shot me." So I said,
Wow.
but I still feel bad that we didn't go back and look for him. But again, I didn't think he got out.
Right.
So anything happened to Kyle, I figure it's all on me, but whatever. So anyway, we egress out. I ended up with 1 tank hung, 1 napalm can I had to get rid of, had to jettison it because I was going too fast. It didn't come off, but it did jettison, and we came back and landed, did the missing man. We left the number 2 slot open so everybody knew who it was. Got on the ground and went through debrief. Then we hit the bar. Stayed there drinking half the night. About midnight or 1 o'clock, I'm pretty much soused. And somebody comes up to me and said, "You got a call." "What do you mean I have a call?" "Red Cross wants to talk to you." Really? Yeah, where's that? So they take me over to some, by this time they had trailers for the comm units and all that. I guess it was shortwave. And it was the Red Cross notifying me that my oldest son, Mark, had been born on that day. So he was born on the same day that Kyle got shot down. So it's hard for me to forget his birthday.
Definitely.
Anyway, we flew a couple more missions after that, but then it was time for our squadron to come back to McConnell, and the 562nd replaced us. So they came over and picked up where we left off. And that's why I've only got 44 missions.